Welcome to lecture number 61. The topic is 6.7, Labor in the Gilded Age. The theme is Work Exchange and Technology. The last lecture covered the industrial leaders during the Gilded Age, and this lecture covers those who were in the actual factories, those who were working for these industrial leaders. There's one learning objective: explain the socio-economic continuities and changes associated with the growth of industrial capitalism from 1865 to 1898. The first key concept is, as the price of many goods decreased, workers' real wages increased, providing a new access to a variety of goods and services. Many Americans' standard of living improved, while the gap between rich and poor grew. Up to this point, we have painted a pretty grim picture of the workers during the Gilded Age. Working conditions were dangerous, hours were long, weekends didn't exist, cities were crowded and unsanitary. But there is some nuance, or at least one positive aspect to their position. Their wages and their spending power increased throughout the entire Gilded Age because of the economic expansion that was going on. The price of goods decreased due to greater consolidation from the large businesses, greater amounts of transportation that made shipping goods faster and cheaper, and the production of goods increased. When the supply of goods increases, the prices will also go down. The top table of U.S. economic data shows that throughout the late 19th century, the gross national product of the United States continued to grow from 1869 to 1897. There was almost a tripling of the gross national product, and workers' real wages increased as a result. Real wage is an economic term that does not refer exactly to the amount of money that a worker is paid. A real wage is the amount of money that someone is paid when taking into consideration the amount of inflation in the economy and the worker's purchasing power. The purchasing power increases over time in this era, regardless of the nominal wage, that is, the actual amount of money that they were being paid. The bottom table is a little bit more complicated, but it shows that in the 1870s, the real annual earnings at first stay the same, but by the 1880s, they start to go up. In 1870, the real wage is $375. By the year 1900, it goes up to $573. At the same time, inflation is going down. That means that the money that each person earns is able to buy more. Inflation is measured by the Consumer Price Index. On this table, any time that number goes below 100, that means that inflation is going down. And throughout this entire period, when the CPI is being measured, it goes from 124 to 84. Urban families are able to earn more, but they still have to have multiple forms of income. The father, the mother, and a lot of the times the child would go out to work to afford the daily expenses. Life in the cities were pretty poor. It was crowded and it was dirty. There were new types of building called dumbbell tenements were created in order to fit more people in a limited amount of space. At first, these tenements were just rectangular in shape, but after laws and regulations of living conditions in big cities were adopted, they were required to have at least one window to increase airflow. The architecture of the buildings adapted so that an air shaft on either side of the building was added so that even if an adjacent building was built directly on the lot line, there would still be some airflow into the tenement. Rooms inside of the tenements were very small, and there would be multiple people living inside of one room. There were 6 or 7 people in a very small room, as the picture in the bottom left shows. It was taken by Jacob Riis in his investigative book titled How the Other Half Lives. In it, he gives a written account and provides images of how people in the inner city lived. A lot of the times, the people who lived in the inner city were immigrants who had just recently come to the United States to work. Suburbs are in their early stages in this time period, but the people who would live in the suburbs likely had more money because they'd have to commute into the city by rail. The wealth gap continued to grow, with the richest 10% controlling 90% of America's wealth. People looked to these uber-rich industrialists like Andrew Carnegie, J.D. Rockefeller, and they looked to them as inspiration for what they could potentially achieve one day. Carnegie himself was an immigrant from Scotland. Author Horatio Alger wrote a series of books on actual people that came to the United States with very little money and became rich within one generation. This is the birth of the American rags to riches story that is popularized by Alger's writings. The next key concept says, labor and management battled over wages and working conditions, with workers organizing local and national unions and or directly confronting business leaders. The notable unions that you need to remember are the National Labor Union, the Knights of Labor, and the American Federation of Labor. They're prominent in the years listed here. The National Labor Union was prominent until 1877. Then the Knights of Labor take over until 1886. The AFL is still around today, though in the 20th century they merged with the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or CIO. Today they are known as the AFL-CIO. The Knights of Labor was the most inclusive of all the labor unions. They allowed skilled and unskilled workers, men and women, black or white. They lose popularity after they become associated with a strike that turned violent in the city of Chicago, dubbed the Haymarket Square Riot. The tactics of labor unions included strikes. A strike is when people stop working and picket outside of the company until their demands are met. They could use boycotts to hurt the profits of the company to try and get management to meet workers' demands. Slowdowns would be a decrease in the speed of production, a more subtle way to strike. The most important tactic that is at the heart of all union tactics is collective bargaining. This is when the union is given permission to represent all workers in labor negotiations with management. It gives the union much more leverage when they can say that they have the support of all the workers. Some of these strikes and tactics get violent, partially because labor organizations are unpopular, and management often hired private security as strike breakers or could ask the federal government to step in and end the strikes. The notable strikes include the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. This is the first really big one, and it started in the railroad industry, but then it expanded into all of the related industries. It was nationwide, and because it impacted all industries that use the railroads for shipping, that covers almost all other industries. President Rutherford Hayes calls in troops to stop the strikes. That was the first instance in which troops were called to stop the strikers and get them back to work. The Haymarket Affair in 1886 started as a May Day parade. It was essentially a Labor Day parade that was organized by the Knights of Labor, but because some anarchists came in and threw bombs at policemen, the Knights of Labor were blamed for it, and so therefore they lost popularity and began to fade. That paved the way for the American Federation of Labor to be the next big labor union. The Homestead Strike in 1892 at the Carnegie Steel Factory was in response to a cut in wages by the management. Violence broke out after workers carried out a lockout to prevent scab workers from taking their jobs, and the factory's management called in the Pinkerton Private Security Force. In the Pullman strike in 1894, the Pullman Sleeping Car Company operated a company town in which workers worked at a factory and then lived in company housing that they paid for from their wages. They bought provisions from company stores, which would also be deducted from their pay. The Pullman Company started to cut wages of the workers and at the same time increase rents in the company town. If it had been as easy as leaving their job, the strike might have been more peaceful, but before quitting or taking on a new job, workers had to pay off any debts incurred in the company town, tying some workers to their jobs. The government got involved, but on the side of the Pullman Company, and issued a court injunction to stop the labor strike. So here's a complete list of the tactics of management. There's lockouts, which kept striking workers from going into the factory. Industries would also have blacklists, which would include the names of any labor organizations and organizers that they knew of. They would not be hired and so therefore could not organize a new group of workers. Yellow dog contracts were types of contracts that prohibited workers from joining a labor union. If they did, then they could contractually lose their job. The Pinkertons were a private security force, and as mentioned, they were used in the Homestead Strike. A lot of the times when these private security forces were used, it escalated into more violence and people killed. Court injunctions were issued by judges, forcing workers to go back to work and to stop the strike or risk arrest. A lot of times, the reasoning that the courts gave to these injunctions was that the industry that was being picketed, boycotted, or enduring a strike were so important towards national security or the national infrastructure that work must resume. And the final key concept says the industrial workforce expanded and child labor increased. The labor force increased the rate of industrialization and therefore increases the need for more labor. Immigrants provide a large amount of workers, and because of the abundance of workers, it leads to lower wages. A typical work week for an industrial worker would be about 10 hours a day and 6 days a week. This is the time period in which labor unions start to advocate for an 8-hour workday. Finally, 20% of children worked outside of the home by the 1900s, and this was up from 12% in 1870. Reformers in the 1890s viewed this as a big problem. Lewis Hine was a photographer who worked for an advocacy group that was trying to end child labor, so he went all across the country to document children at work to put a visual face to child labor and the difficult working conditions that they endured. He went to mines, textile mills, glass-blowing factories, and in all of them he was able to find children working. His photographs will eventually help to pass legislation ending child labor, but not until the 20th century. Alright, here's the recap. Workers' wages were rising and purchasing power rose, however, economic disparity was still growing. Discontent in labor led to the rise of labor unions, yet at this time labor unions are still experiencing limited success. Management, with the help of government, is slowing the progress of unions, and management is utilizing their own tactics in dealing with those unions, and finally, child labor became a more common problem. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click on the video link on the screen, and if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit APUSHslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying, and look forward to seeing you back on the next lecture.